This is the Reading with Rachelle podcast, where we explore history we never learned in school through the books we never read in school, but wish we had and should have. I'm Rachelle Chase, a columnist and author of Creating the Black Utopia of Buxton, Iowa, along with 8 other books and novellas. If you like this podcast, don't forget to subscribe at rachellechase.substack.com or rachellechasewrites.com for the latest episode and other news. This episode, I'm discussing the book In Defense of the Nation, Black Iowans at War, with the author, Dr. William S. Morris. In his book, Dr. Morris chronicles the contributions and trailblazing feats of Black soldiers from the Civil War to the First Persian Gulf War. Our discussion includes their contributions, along with those of trailblazing African American women in the military during and after their service, highlighting how their military roles helped to pave the way for civil rights advancements and professional success in numerous fields. Dr. Morris's passion for American history shines through, and you'll want to have pen and paper on hand to jot down all the names of the notable people in history that he shares. A little bit about Dr. Morris. Dr. William S. Morris is a published author, educator, historian, public speaker, and third-generation lawyer, retired, from Iowa, where his family was deeply involved in the civil rights movement and newspaper publishing. A visionary and conservative, Morris teaches, researches, and writes about African American history. In addition to his book, In Defense of the Nation, Black Iowans at War, he contributed the chapter on military history in Outside In, African American History in Iowa, 1838 to 2000. The chapters Black Soldiers in the Civil War and The Buffalo Soldiers in the Indian Wars for the book Black Faces of War, which he co-authored with his late brother, Robert Morris. He is the author of numerous newspaper articles and has written several papers on low-intensity warfare and crime, the militarization of law enforcement, and the evolution of street gangs into insurgent organizations. For more information about Dr. Morris, visit williamsmorris.org. Now, let's start reading with Rachelle. Okay, William, welcome to Reading with Rachelle. I'm happy to have you here today.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. To be here.
I wanted to ask you, when we talk about your book, In Defense of the Nation, Black Iowans at War, for those who haven't read it, give me your elevator pitch. What's the book about?
This book is about the military service of Black men and women in Iowa from the Civil War to the First Persian Gulf War. That's a span of approximately 130 years. I do allude to earlier Black military service in the Revolutionary War, and that's where the abolitionist movement started. It didn't start a few years before the Civil War. It came directly out of the Revolutionary War. There are Black men who fought for George Washington with great distinction, about between 5,000 and 7,000 of them. And many of these men went on to become quite successful in civilian life. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, not just what these men and women did in military service during the wars, but what they did afterward, because they spearheaded the Black civil rights movements. They became doctors, lawyers, school teachers, every area of human endeavor these men and women entered. And it's the military service that kicked down a lot of doors in the private sector. They didn't do it willingly, but Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948 that desegregated the military, that began a process that eventually extended to the private sector today. In an increasingly diverse American workforce, you must deal with the issues of diversity in race, in gender, and these other issues, and that's part of America today. America has come through a lot of painful times, but we have come through remarkably well, given the fact that we have such a diverse population now. We fought the Civil War. Black people, over a long period of time, got their rights. Native Americans, Hispanics, women, Asian Americans, all these groups, but it all came out of the Black civil rights movement. And it was some painful times, often violent, harsh and unjust, but we successfully came through it. And you look at it today with the success that African Americans have had in business, in the arts, in education, in sports, in the law and medicine, and the engineering, internet and artificial intelligence, all sorts of things. It's just, I see these young people coming up today, they have opportunities that I didn't have when I was coming up. And if you're educated, if you know your stuff, the sky's the limit. It really is. These companies go out and look for young non-whites who know their stuff, who can work in these high-tech capacities.
Yeah, and when we're talking about success, that's one of the things that stood out in your book, where you talk about, of course, the racism that these soldiers and people in the service experienced, all the exclusion, the tactics that were meant to keep them out, the fact that they were believed to be cowards, we're believed to be cowards, and we're going to run away from fights. All of these negative things that, again, another area where Black people have to prove themselves and prove that we can do this. So you cover that part, but then you also do a great job of balancing that with, yeah, but look at, in spite of all that, these are the heroic deeds, the successes that men and women have had in these various wars and branches of the military. I'm assuming that was by design, that you did that on purpose.
That's correct.
Maybe you could just give the reader some examples, maybe taking from the Civil War or the Spanish-American War or whatever war, to give an example of that balance that you do really well in this book.
I like to point out what these men and women did during the war. I have a man named Solomon Stratton who was an escaped slave from Virginia and came back to Iowa with a General Verbeck, and he settled around the Manly, Iowa area. This man married the daughter of a fellow Black Civil War veteran, bought a farm, raised 9 children on the farm. He owned several hundred acres on the Iowa and Minnesota sides of the border. And there's another man who won the Medal of Honor, Mr. Gardner, James Daniel Gardner, who settled in near Ottumwa, Iowa, and near the post office and became a Catholic missionary. We have, during the Buffalo Soldiers, there's a man named John Heath, interestingly also from Virginia, who served with Troop K, 9th U.S. Cavalry against the Apache in the Southwest. Distinguished himself in combat, came back here, married, and bought a house in Des Moines and raised 12 children here, one of whom was a client of mine years ago. And then George Woodson, Sergeant, Company I, 25th U.S. Infantry, got his law degree from Howard University, came to Iowa and became a very successful lawyer, was president of the Mahaska County Bar Association, co-founder of the Niagara Movement in the NAACP, and later co-founder of the National Negro Bar Association. And so you have just examples of incredible accomplishment that these men did that contributed greatly to our society. And there's an excerpt in there of how a German secret agent tried to corrupt Woodson into closing his law practice and giving him a job at Rock Island Arsenals to put a bomb in there to blow it up. So Woodson said he immediately went to the authorities, military and civil authorities at the federal and state level, took his report to Judge Wade in court, the judge signed the order, and it was reported to the War Department, and they strengthened the guard. So that's just one example of how African Americans have gone above and beyond when a lot of white people believed that blacks would undermine the country, that we would be susceptible to German or Japanese subversion, communist subversion in Korea and Vietnam and on. And every time our performance was incredible, it paved the way. It changed a lot of white people's hearts. Remember, when Iowa first became a state in 1846, they had territorial laws in 1844 they called black codes.
Right.
Any free black that came into this territory and later state had to post a performance bond in cash, livestock, or crops to guarantee their good behavior. Less than 25 years later, Iowa recognized a black man's right to vote in 1868, 2 years before the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, and desegregated its public schools. And so those two developments laid the groundwork for some incredible accomplishments by black men and women in this state for the next 75, 80 years. Because with the advantages of education, in my father's example, taking basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, he and all the other Iowans were immediately promoted to non-commissioned officers rank, again, because of their academic superiority. And my father went on, of course, to officers candidate school, where he graduated first in his class over 580 white men and 19 black men at Camp Columbia in Brisbane, Australia in June of 1943, I believe, and graduated first in his class. And then Lieutenant General Walter Kruger specifically requested my father to be added to the intelligence corps, First Corps Intelligence, the Alamo Scouts. That was a forerunner of the Army's Green Beret, so my father was not only the first black man in U.S. Army Special Forces, he was also the first to command white troops in combat. And I've got photographs and copies of orders. There's a copy of secret orders dated 1944, April of 44, I believe, that authorizes him to travel by water and report to Alamo Force Headquarters. He would later desegregate the dormitories at the University of Iowa. And again, because of his military service, and he told me the story about that before he died, only the white students could vote to whether blacks are going to be allowed to stay in the dormitories and eat in the dining halls. Now, blacks could attend the University of Iowa going back to the 1870s,
right,
but they could not stay in the dormitories and they could not eat in the dining halls. Because of my father's military service, he was the first one admitted there. And the vote was close because, I say, blacks could not vote, only the whites. 50 white U.S. Army officers stood up to support him. And that's how it happened. And so he was the first black student to stay in the dormitories. He graduated law school in 1949, became the first black assistant county attorney in Iowa here in Polk County, and its first criminal prosecutor. That was in 1950. That was before I was born. And I give these examples of Joseph Howard, who was commanded an integrated military police company in the Philippines, guarding Japanese prisoners. He later became the first black federal court judge in Baltimore, Maryland in the late 1960s. He had two brothers, one of whom was a civil rights lawyer, the other one was a college professor. But their father was one of the graduates of the Fort Des Moines Officers Corps, Charles Howard Sr., in 1917. He was there with my grandfather, Samuel Joseph Brown, and those are three of the five founders of the National Bar Association. The fourth one was Woodson, who was also a soldier, and of course Gertrude Durden Rush, who was the first black woman to practice law in Iowa. These are people who, that's who we stand on their shoulders. Gertrude Durden Rush not only was a successful lawyer, she had offices here in Des Moines, in Buxton, and in Chicago. And my grandmother told me she and 5 other black women bought a home for unwed mothers during the Depression, for black unwed mothers during the Depression here in Des Moines. Matter of fact, Gertrude Rush's house still stands down on Martin Luther King Avenue. It's still there.
Oh, my God.
She was a remarkable woman in her own right. A lot of people don't know there was a black woman who masqueraded as a man that served in the Buffalo Soldier regiments. Yeah. Kathy Williams switched her name around to William Kathy and served for a year and a half with the 24th U.S. Infantry, I believe, before her masquerade was discovered in a medical examination.
And she had to fight to get her pension.
Oh, yes, she did.
Yeah,
yes, she did.
I remember that.
She did. And there was another black mixed-race woman, what was her name? Gannett. Deborah Simpson Gannett masqueraded as a man named Robert Shurtleff in the Revolutionary War and fought for over a year in combat. I don't refer to that in the book, but that's a remarkable story in itself because after the Revolutionary War, she was awarded a cash bounty by the Continental Congress for her military service. Wow. Deborah Simpson Gannett. Yeah, it's fascinating. You read history, it's just fascinating. Most people don't know there was a black woman who was a mechanic for the Tuskegee Airmen. Marjorie Cheatham, she was a licensed certified flight mechanic in the 1940s, right here in America. Yeah. And so the black people were accomplishing things that people do today, they really can't comprehend how this happened. And Queen Bess Coleman and Armstrong and these women who were pilots back in the 1920s. So black people have been doing things in this country that defy explanation. We had black millionaires in this country back in the 1840s. And it's just black business development. A lot of people focused on the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1922, which was horrible. Many black people were killed, their businesses and homes burned to the ground. Many of them were put in prison. All their insurance claims were denied. Over $12 million in insurance claims were denied, but in less than 7 years, Black Wall Street was rebuilt. How was it rebuilt? Where did they get the money? They got loans from the St. Luke Penny Bank that had been established by a black woman in Richmond, Virginia, only 35 years after the end of the Civil War. It's just there's just the stories of black resilience. Matter of fact, her name was Magdalena Walker. Magdalena Walker, mother was a former black slave, father was a white Confederate Civil War veteran. She established that bank in 1903. She chartered it in Richmond. That bank survived the stock market crash of the 1920s, survived the Depression. It merged with another bank in the 50s, and so really technically it's still going today, but it's just unheard of that a black woman would do that back in 1903, 38 years after the end of the Civil War, in Richmond, which was eventually the capital of the Confederacy. Time and time again, we see black men and women accomplishing extraordinary things, and I wanted to point that out in the book because there's a lot of this critical race theory stuff that's going around in schools. I think it's had a really adverse impact on race relations in the classroom because it makes kids hate their country. And it makes kids hate each other. And I teach in the high school and the middle school levels down in Texas.
When you say it makes kids hate their country, yes. Are you talking about kids of both races, or you're talking about...
all races. It makes it look like America's such a horrible place. Slavery and discrimination and rapes and lynchings and all these things. Yes, these things went on, but black people overcame them. They overcame them. And that's what the real story needs to be.
I like the balance, meaning if you just focus on, okay, this is what we did, we overcame, then you don't really get just how significant that was. I think what bothers me is if you only focus on that. Yes. Like you're only going to talk about slavery, the negative aspects. You're only going to talk about racism and the Klan and all of that. But then you're not countering that narrative with, yes, but look how black people fought. Even in slavery, black people weren't sitting around passively accepting slavery. There were a lot that were resisting in different ways. So I think to me, it bothers me when you don't see the both sides, which is what I like about your book, is that you are talking about, yes, this was the racism. Yes, it was almost like begrudgingly they were allowed into the service. Something that was surprising to me was even with the Civil War, of course, they didn't want black men fighting. They didn't trust them with guns, which to me, if you don't trust them with guns, obviously you knew you did something wrong, right? Yes. But there were other reasons, like not being competent. So it's almost like the black people were able to fight and be allowed in the service begrudgingly because the country realized we need more men to fight. Fine. So you have some interesting statements here, which I hadn't thought about. There was this part, I think, on page 11 when you're talking about the Civil War, and you talked about the black volunteers credited to Iowa's wartime manpower quota. It had exempted over 2,000 white Iowans from the 1864 draft. Missouri was allotted 200 members of the regiment to its own manpower quota, but Iowa received credit for the remaining 700 through 3-year enlistments. I hadn't really thought about black men replacing white men on a quota system, because then you talk about Kirkwood later saying that, yeah, we want black people to die. We don't just want all the white soldiers to die. So anyway, that was an interesting fact. I hadn't really thought about that.
Well, that goes back to the Revolutionary War, when slave owners would say, I'm not going to send my white son to military service, but I'll send a slave. That's the way a lot of black men got their freedom. Not all of them, but slavery is a remarkable history in itself.
I'm trying to find here, there was something else. There was lots of interesting bits, but there were different, like I knew about the Buffalo Soldiers, but I didn't know they did all these other things. So you have 11 different things that the Buffalo Soldiers did. So can you talk about some of these other things that they did?
And I got this list from the Buffalo Soldiers Museum in Houston, Texas. I have visited there several times. If you're ever in Houston, please go to the Buffalo Soldiers Museum.
I didn't even know it existed, so that was good too.
Yes, 3816 Caroline Street in Houston, Texas.
Awesome.
Anyway, in addition to their military duties, Buffalo Soldiers explored and created maps of uncharted wilderness, which paved the way for oncoming pioneer settlers, and also told them where they could find clean water. They assisted civil authorities in controlling mobs. They pursued outlaws, cattle thieves, and Mexican revolutionaries along the border, including Billy the Kid. Built and renovated dozens of posts and camps, constructed thousands of miles of roads and telegraph lines. They protected settlers and work crews building the Transcontinental Railroad. They served as the first U.S. Border Patrol. They rode shotgun on stagecoaches. They protected the giant redwood trees of California before the establishment of the U.S. Forest Service. They escorted wagon trains. They delivered mail longer than the Pony Express. So those are just some of the things these men had accomplished. In addition, the black cavalry were the first to experiment with bicycles in lieu of horses, and the black infantry were the first to use the machine gun. The old Colt potato digger machine gun, that was first, the black troops were the first trained on those weapons. So it's a fascinating history. These men had record low rates of desertion, record low rates of drunkenness on duty, which was the scourge of the frontier army. And they went on to compile a distinguished service record on the plains, 20 Medals of Honor on the plains, and another 5 in Cuba. Actually 6, because 1 of 5 were black soldiers. One was a black sailor by the name of Robert Penn, who saved the USS Iowa from explosion during the Spanish-American War. Mm-hmm. It's a fascinating story. I would like young people in particular to take pride in knowing who they are, where they came from. And my recommendation to other ethnic groups, my book focuses on African-American soldiers. You could do it on Native American soldiers, Hispanics, Asians, women, Jewish soldiers, Italian-American soldiers, anything you want. I think these kinds of things, it shows how despite our antagonisms, despite the racism, despite ethnic problems, we have come together as a nation. And one of the ways they did it was through military service.
You mentioned women there, and you do mention a few in your book as well. Of course, there's the Black Wax that were trained at Fort Des Moines and a couple of other locations and made up the 688, which everybody hopefully has seen movies and knows about that. But then you mentioned some that aren't as well known, like Arlene Janet Roberts. I think you mentioned some others. You want to talk about like the black women's role?
Yes, there are 8,000 black women that trained at Fort Des Moines. It was 72,000 women of other races. These women served in every role except combat. They distinguished themselves. This with Rosie the Riveter, as it were, the women working in the defense plants. This was the first kick in the door, as it were, to the women's movement that for women's equality and rights. You have to understand, with all these men overseas in the Pacific and Europe, Women ran businesses. They sat on school boards. They ran for office. They raised families. They made money. They had the famous female suffragettes said every woman should have her own purse. This is where it started because these women.
Wait, when you say this is where it started, you mean here in Iowa?
Yeah, in part because, one, with the black wax, but also these women that worked all over the country in the defense plants. And my mother, who grew up her father died when she was 6 years old. She and her siblings were raised by her grandparents. My mother earned an academic scholarship to the University of Iowa in 1944 and went on to type the plans for the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. She was one of 12 black women given top secret security clearances to type the plans at the University of Chicago Department of Metallurgy. And there she worked alongside the noted black physicist J. Ernest Wilkins, Jr., who was known as the Negro Genius because he had gotten his bachelor's degree, I think at 16 or 17, and gotten his master's at 18, his PhD at 19. And he was a distinguished mathematician and scientist. And I believe there were 10 or 11 other black scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project for the atomic bombs. My mother spoke of that often and how that experience, she didn't marry my father. She didn't marry my father until after the war. But that experience and her college education, it later motivated her to go back and get her master's degree, and she became the first black licensed clinical psychologist in Iowa in 1967 after she got her master's degree at Drake University. There are dozens of other women who've done the same thing. They had gone back into civilian life because most of these women lost their jobs when the men came back from the war. But my mother was in the first wave of women that went back to work in the late 1960s. And, of course, in the 70s was the women's movement, that kind of thing. But this started with World War II in the military and how these women distinguished themselves. James Bowman, who was from Des Moines, who was a Tuskegee Airman, later became our first black assistant superintendent of schools here in Des Moines in the late 1960s, early 70s. He told me a funny story. The black pilots were expecting P-47 Thunderbolt fighters. The P-47 was a big plane, big engine, 850 caliber machine guns, underwing racks for fuel tanks and bombs and rockets. And some male pilots had trouble flying them. The first 50 planes that came in, he said, these guys are great pilots. They made perfect three-point landings at Moulton Field at Tuskegee. They were all flown by women from the WASPs, the Women's Air Corps. And they were just, they took their helmets off and said, "Here you go, boys." But that just goes to show you, the progress that was made, not just for these black pilots, but women were getting their foot in the door, and women of all races. And yes, it wasn't perfect at Fort Des Moines because there was segregation. The black women were only allowed to use the swimming pool for 1 hour on Friday, and after that it was drained and purified and all the other old racist stereotypes. But these women nevertheless overcame and went on to do great things. And the Tyler Perry's movie, The 6888, commanded by Charity Edna Adams, she was the first black female commissioned officer, and that was at Fort Des Moines in 1942. And she went on to lead that unit in England. And there were 3 black women from Iowa that served in the 6888. So it's just, I hope everybody sees the movie. It was on Netflix. I don't know if it's still there or not. That's where I saw it. And it's an excellent movie, and I strongly recommend it. Yeah,
it's so funny. When I was working for the Register, I was trying so hard to get people that were working on the movie, the play. I was like, put Des Moines in there. In fact, I believe Charity Adams was like, when she was at Fort Des Moines, when the whole idea for this came about, and planning was done in Fort Des Moines. So I think we talked a little bit before this interview about why you wrote the book, what inspired you to write the book. And you've touched upon that a little bit in some of your answers to these questions, but maybe you could just answer that question.
Yes, my motivation was to honor the service of these men and women, many of whom I grew up with, to show young people what they did, not only what they did for the country during time of war, but what they did afterward. I want them to get to know that America is the greatest country in the world. Yes, it has a lot of faults, and we're not there yet for everybody. But just Luther Smith said, who was a Tuskegee Airman from Des Moines, he said, despite its many faults, black people knew that America offered us the best deal. He said, I did not fight for this country as it then existed. I fought for America for what it could be, a better land that his sacrifices would mean a better life for his children and his grandchildren. That's exactly what happened. Vincent Lewis, another educator, was an artilleryman in Vietnam, told me the same thing. He came back from the military in Vietnam. He worked 2 full-time jobs and went to school at night. He said, I make a better life for my children and my grandchildren. He became the first black high school principal in the Des Moines public school system at North High School. He was my oldest son's middle school principal at Brody Middle School. My first black male teacher at Franklin Junior High School in 1971, Clarence Burno, had just come back and severely wounded in combat in Vietnam. came back, multiple operations. He was shot 9 times in an ambush and survived. He just retired as a principal in Atlanta, Georgia, a high school principal in Atlanta, Georgia. I wanted to show how so many of these men and women came out and were educators. There was another man in there from Marshalltown, George Johnson, who was a combat medic in a U.S. Army unit in Korea in a heavy weapons platoon. He came back and became an art teacher for 34 years in the Omaha, Nebraska public school system. Time and time again, I want to show young people that America is worth something, that black men and women have shed their blood in this country since 1776 to the present. And nobody can say that we're not American citizens and we have not earned the right to be treated as equals, because black men and women spilled their blood for this nation in every war it's ever fought. And we can see that today in the number of black generals. Look at Colin Powell, rifle platoon commander in Vietnam. Army Ranger, later became our first black Secretary of State. He was the first black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was commander-in-chief of U.S. forces in Kuwait in 1990. And he was just a remarkable man. He just died a little while ago, but we just had our first black 4-star general in the Marine Corps just a while back. And I don't talk about it in this book, but all our earliest black generals, Chappie James, fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He was our first black 4-star general. That was in the U.S. Air Force. Frank Peterson, the first black general in the Marine Corps, he flew the F-4 Phantom in Vietnam. And, of course, General Powell. But our first black general actually was Benjamin O. Davis Sr. in 1939. He got his Brigadier General stars in 1939. And his son, Benjamin O. Davis Jr., commanded the Tuskegee Airmen in World War II, the 332nd Fighter Squadron and the 99th Pursuit. He went on to become the first black general in the Air Force in 1958. So, again, we see how military service and sacrifice have paved the way, not only kicking in doors for black men and women in the military, but in the private sector as well. I've given you some examples of men and women who have gone on to incredible accomplishments because of their military service that opened the door for them. And there are so many other examples I can give you here in Iowa and around the country, but the qualifying factor is almost like they had proved their worth. They had shown America what they could do. And that in turn kicked in the door for the civilian sector. These were men and women who gave everything they had for service to this country. And in so doing, they pushed us all up to the next level. We stand on their shoulders. So that's why I wrote this book. It shows black military service from 1863 to 1991. And perhaps someday I'll do an update up to the present. But I want kids to know that America is the greatest country in the world, that everybody, that not just African Americans, we've all come together to fight. However imperfectly it was done. Yes, there was racism, there was discrimination. We still have a problem with that in the military today. There's a serious problem with sexual assault, and they're trying to deal with it. So I'm hoping, and I'm seeing a lot more women in the military, particularly in the officer corps, particularly in the Air Force, but it's in all the service branches. So I'm hoping that will help alleviate some of that.
Great. I hope people listening will pick up your book, In Defense of the Nation, Black Iowans at War, and I hope they will enjoy it as much as I did and learn as much as I did, because military is just not in my area of expertise, so it was very informative. So I want to thank you for that. Before we end, is there anything else that I haven't asked you that you want to say?
I think we've covered just about everything. I do want to give credit to 2 people. My dear wife, who designed that cover you see on that book. My dear wife, Amelia, designed that. And nice. Then her nephew, Nathan Hamilton, had a lot to do with the photography and some of the other enhancements of the pictures in there, the photographs. So I want to give both of them shout-outs because they had great contributions to what you see before you.
Wonderful. And where can people buy your book?
This book is available through BookBaby. It's also Amazon.com. You can buy it through most of the mainline booksellers. It will be for sale at Barnes & Noble and various other retail establishments, so you can go online and order it. I think it's a unique book. I poured out my heart in it, and I want people to know that it shows how Americans, particularly black Americans, still love this country despite all the injustice that was done to it. We have stood up when the country needed us. We fought hard, and we proved our worth as Americans and as citizens and as God-fearing people. So that's what I want everybody to know.
Wonderful. Thank you again for being on Reading with Rachelle.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Reading with Rachelle. To learn more about my guest, Dr. William S. Morris, and his book, In Defense of the Nation, Black Iowans at War, visit his website at williamsmorris.org. You can also find another informative interview with Dr. Morris by my friend and fellow podcaster Eric Nganyange on his podcast, the Iowa Civil Rights History Podcast. Lastly, if you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support my podcast, please leave a rating and review, plus subscribe at RachelleChase.substack.com or RachelleChaseWrites.com.